Hey, it's Nicholas with the first of 5 parts of an overview presentation addressing space-time dimensionality in the science of consciousness, or more precisely, an overview of my approach to that topic. So to cut to the punchline, the thrust of this presentation will be to explain why we'll almost certainly need an extra-dimensional approach to the science of consciousness, likely with multiple time dimensions. And to clarify, the exploration of extra dimensions in this presentation will focus on a macro scale, sort of terrestrial to universal spatiotemporal magnitude, rather than approaching the Planck scale or even addressing protophysical dimensions at scales smaller than, or perhaps prior to even the Planck scale. That's not to say that those kinds of things aren't valid at all. One of the things that we'll have to do one day is to examine the micro-macro extra dimensionality relationships, so to speak. But today is almost all about setting out the macro. So one more clarification. Today, as in almost all of my current work in science, I'm actually going to focus on the science of conscious experience, subjective experience, or phenomenal consciousness, as it's also known. So let's begin with an orientation to some of the fundamental issues. So the basic entities in a science of conscious experience, apart from the brain of the experiencer, assuming as I will, that brain encoded information minimally shapes the contents of conscious experience. The basic entities again are an object like a matter chair, studied in conventional physics, and then the conscious experience of that object. And these two things, the matter chair and the experiential chair, are not directly the same thing, despite what surprisingly many people still think. So if you think that the matter chair and the experiential chair are the same, take a look at an experiential chair or an experiential hand and cross your eyes. So the experiential object splits into two, which it couldn't do if it were identical to the matter object, because splitting of the matter object by crossing the eyes would violate conservation of matter energy. So now, because we have two entity kinds to relate, we're going to need two symbol classes. So let's write italic chair as an atypical but straightforward symbol for the matter chair. For example, italic chair could stand in for a long list of fundamental particle states that make up the matter chair. And now we're going to introduce this novel symbol, pronounced angle brackets chair, to label the experience that a typical human experiencer has when they look at the specific matter system labeled by italic chair. Crucially, the appearance, the same symbol, italic chair, inside this new symbolism for experience provides a powerful link between existing mathematical physics and a new rigorous science of conscious experience. Now, although I've drawn the matter chair illustratively here, as if it existed in some sort of classical naive realist form, in fact, this symbolism, today's analysis, and pretty much the entirety of my scientific work in this domain is valid however we conceive of the matter domain existing or even not existing in a solid way. For example, one conceptual frame I sometimes find useful is to say, my experience functions as if there were a matter domain out there, following the mathematical order characterized by physics. Equally, I also find classical realism useful at other times. And all of these ontological stances are, of course, consistent, or can be, with a single mathematics, the core theories of mathematical physics. So I've heard it said that experience is two-dimensional or flat. And of course, for those of you watching this on a flat computer screen, it is flat, although not by the end of the presentation intellectually flat, I hope. But thinking about the more than 2D experience that you get in a virtual reality presentation can help ground the point that human visual experience is actually, to first order, three-dimensional. It has depth as well as height and width. Okay, so that's a tiny taste of the spatial aspects of experience. What about the temporal? When does conscious experience occur? For example, if this brain starts looking at this matter chair at a given time t, when does the corresponding conscious experience begin? Now, if conscious experience is a passive property, which doesn't transfer incremental information from experience into brain organism activity, then conscious experience could be a movie simultaneous to, long after, or even long before the physics studied events it represents, assuming those events actually even happen in some sense. But of course, one natural and frequently made assumption is that conscious experience occurs roughly simultaneously with the brain encoding of experiential contents. But that is an assumption and should be declared as such, because things that seem obvious rarely are so in the science of conscious experience, at least in my experience of that science. So now we've had a first go round on space and time. Conscious experience is a 3D movie, and we really have no idea where and when it takes place without further assumptions. So it looks like it's really going to be very hard to make any progress. But let's go back to the symbolism and put in spatial coordinates now, rho, and a time coordinate tau for angle brackets chair to complement conventional RT coordinates for matter objects labeled or pointed to by this italic chair symbol. Now, of course, putting new coordinate indices in here doesn't really imply anything at all about the fundamental dimensionality of reality, which is the topic. For example, rho and tau could just turn out to be very straightforward functions of r and t, although an exact and naive tau t identity doesn't really hold up for quite simple reasons that we'll see in a moment. Or rho and tau could be distinct, independent physical degrees of freedom, as illustrated in this 8-dimensional r, rho, t, tau construction. Or we could end up in one of many, many other views about the dimensionality of matter and experience. Now, pressing on with symbolism just a little more, because each experiencer has their own image of a common object, we need to introduce a new integer index to label different experiencers here, sub 1 and sub 2. And in maximal generality, we need to add this sub-index both to image and coordinate system. So now let's put the brains in and switch from a generic stylized chair symbol to these SAB symbols. So this is a symbol for the the Bth element of the 8th stimulus class, located at a matter location RC, and this gives rise, each of these gives rise to a corresponding component of experience, angle brackets SAB, at an experiential location rho C corresponding to the matter location RC. So now briefly, the central equation of sensory computational neuroscience relates these perceptually atomistic visual stimuli, SAB, at locations RC, to the brain activity A that encodes those stimuli. So a different issue is the central equation of conscious experiential science, which relates brain activity A, again, including those encodings of RT located SAB, to a set of corresponding conscious experiential components, angle brackets SAB, of rho, C, and tau. Now, this may look like symbolism gone crazy, but I just want to show rho, tau symbols in the context of sort of the total problem of conscious experiential science, at least the total problem according to current mainstream approaches. And the reason for placing dimension indexing rho, tau symbols explicitly in this larger context is because various sub-problems, the dimensional problem we're looking at today, locality and geometry problems, and a dynamical information coupling problem, to name just 3, these are not totally separable. So useful information about each sub-problem is contained in the others. So completely breaking up the treatment isn't optimal, to put it mildly. Now, if you feel that we just spent 10 minutes developing an elaborate symbolism for almost total dimensional ignorance, I have a lot of sympathy with that view. But what we can do now is return to basic spatial and temporal issues and use the symbolism and some of the understandings, or the understanding of the multiplicities that the symbolism indexes. First, to structure our ignorance, to develop basic viable categories, and then in relationship to this structured ignorance, we can see if there are ways of getting data or having theoretical insights that trustably arbitrate between basic categories in favor of one and against others. So that's what we'll do in part 2 next for non-relativistic space. In part 3 for time in a relativistic space-time context. In part 4, we'll go deeper into time and look how its historical treatment as a coordinate rather than a movement may be profoundly misleading. And then part 5 will summarize the landscape that we've covered by that time and its frontiers, as well as offering a list of questions to carry forwards for space, for time, and for potential future collaborations between space-time and quantum theorists and theories of consciousness.